In today's video, we'll be taking a look at what could possibly be the best universal remote that money can buy. The Unfolded Circle Remote 3. If you follow my channel for quite a while, you may have seen other videos where I've taken a look at various universal remote controls, and I've been on a bit of a quest to find a remote control that integrates well with my Home Assistant based smart home. However, up until now, there haven't been many good options. Most smart universal remotes are cloud-based devices designed to connect to cloud-connected smart home devices and don't have very good functionality for local network control. Then, at the complete other end of the market, you have very nice high-end remote controls from companies like Control4 and RTI. However, these generally require registered installers to install and configure them, and the programming software isn't available to the end user. So, after a bit of searching, I ended up settling onto the SofaBaton X1 S remotes. I've already made a video about these, and they do the job, but they aren't perfect. They support a decent number of devices over infrared, and they've also now added functionality to allow you to implement local network control of devices using HTTP requests. You can configure custom buttons on the remote, set each of those to an HTTP URL, and it will call that URL when the button is pressed. This generally works pretty well, and I've been using this to send commands to Home Assistant from the remote. However, it's far from perfect. The only way to configure this is through a relatively clunky mobile app that does require a cloud account to log into. And then when it comes setting up those custom URLs, it involves a lot of fiddly copying and pasting of URLs between various pages of the app. It's very time consuming and not that easy to work with. And while this remote does have a screen, it's a bit limited. It can only really show a list of devices that you scroll up and down with using this wheel below it. And this is particularly annoying since this remote doesn't have any sort of number buttons, so the only way to use a number is to scroll up and down on the screen and pick them. It's very time consuming and a bit clunky. So these remotes do work, but they can be quite limited for more complex setups. However, Unfolded Circle have released a remote control that changes all that. It provides full local network control, Home Assistant integration, and even the ability to write your own integrations for custom devices. And it's all managed through a local web interface. So in this video, we'll take a look at it, run through the hardware, take a look at the software setup side of things, and then we'll take a look at it controlling my smart home. So, how did we get here? Well, the Unfolded Circle remotes were initially born out of a Kickstarter campaign, and I backed this around a year ago. It felt like a bit of a gamble, but they did actually manage to build and ship a complete product, and the end result is very impressive. Now, this isn't currently available for general retail sale. However, they are currently accepting pre-orders on their website, and they claim that they'll ship the pre-orders towards the start of 2026. And having used this remote a fair bit, I'm seriously tempted to buy another one. So first up, let's take a look at the hardware. Here we have two separate devices, the remote itself and the docking station. Now, these are sold as two separate parts. Technically, you can use the remote without the docking station, and you could also install multiple docking stations in different rooms around the house and move the remote between them. The docking station is a relatively simple device that essentially acts as an IR blaster and charging station. On the top of the dock, we have an area here containing a range of infrared LEDs, and then in the middle here we have the area with the pins that the remote docks into. And this is how you charge the remote. This also contains a little screen towards the front that shows things like status and that sort of stuff, and a button towards the back of the remote that you can use to put it into different configuration modes and to reset the device and that sort of stuff. Now, the only important thing to bear in mind if you buy one of these with this button is that the previous version of the Unfolded Circle remote instead had its button on the bottom, which was accessed using a paperclip. When I was setting mine up, the on-screen instructions were still referring to this old version of the dock, meaning that I spent quite a while shoving a paperclip into this hole here that actually turned out to be an LED. Now, thankfully I didn't break my dock, and hopefully they've updated the instructions to reflect this, but just something to bear in mind. If you've got the new Unfolded Circle 3 dock, it's this button here, it's not something hidden on the bottom. Then around the back of the dock, we have some ports. We have a USB-C port that's used to power the dock, and it can also be used for firmware flashing. And then we have a pair of 3.5mm jacks. These can be used with external IR emitters, such as these ones that are included, and these can be useful for controlling devices that may be hidden inside a cabinet or somewhere that the IR LEDs in the dock can't reach. This is particularly important because this being a dock, you want this out on show so you can dock the remote onto it, so these can be used to extend the IR to other places. It came with one sort of nice decorative pretty looking one like this with a nice braided cable, and it also came with another more basic one that you could probably use where it's not on show. However, these can also be apparently used as RS-232 serial ports control devices. Now, so far I haven't seen anything related to RS-232 in the software, so I'm not sure if this is fully implemented yet, but hopefully if they can implement that, you could use that too. And then finally, we have an Ethernet port. This can of course be used to connect the dock to the network, but even more excitingly, it also supports PoE, so that's really nice. Single Ethernet cable will power the dock, charge the remote, and give the dock a network connection. So, that was the dock. Now let's take a look at the exciting part, which is the remote itself. And as you can see, this is a really nicely made metal device. Of course this will not come across on camera, but it feels extremely high quality and is very impressive for something to have come out of Kickstarter. If you'd handed me this and told me it was made by the likes of Control 4, I'd absolutely believe you. On the front of the remote we have a large full colour capacitive touchscreen, and then below that we have a little slider area that's used for things like volume controls. Below that we then have a decent range of buttons. You've got your back, home, power buttons, a D-pad, up and down buttons for volume and channel, and then a set of commonly used buttons like play, pause, mute, menu, and so on. Of course this doesn't have buttons for things like numbers, but since you have a nice big large touchscreen, it's easy enough to move those onto this. Then on the top of the remote, we have an IR emitter, and this allows you to control devices directly from the remote without using the docking station. The spec sheet also claims that the remote contains an IR receiver, and that could be used for learning commands from existing remotes. However, the software only seems to currently let you learn commands from the dock, so just bear that in mind if you plan on buying this remote without a dock. At least with the current software, you wouldn't be able to learn IR commands from an existing remote, unless you had the dock as well. Then on the bottom of the remote, we can see we have a set of connectors that are used to charge the remote from the docking station. And then on the back, we have this big black area that has these kind of 4 lines in the middle. This area contains wireless charging, meaning you can charge the remote using a standard wireless charger, not just the docking station. So this does mean you could technically save a bit of money by buying just the remote on its own rather than the dock. However, this does mean that you'd be limited to wireless charging and wouldn't currently have the ability to learn IR codes from existing remotes. The only other thing to bear in mind with this remote is it doesn't contain any sort of USB connector anywhere on it. This isn't a huge deal, however it does mean that you need to remember to keep the remote docked and charging, since if it runs out of power, you're going to have to leave it aside for a while to charge. Whereas with my SofaBaton and X1S remotes, I can charge them using a normal USB-C cable and use the remote while it's charging. I already have a USB-C cable sitting next to my couch for charging things like phones and laptops, so if a remote runs out of battery, it's not a big deal. I just pick up the cable, plug it in, and use the remote. Whereas with the unfolded circle remote, this wouldn't be possible. So now, let's take a quick look at the interface on the remote itself, then we'll go and take a look at the software side of things and see how all this is configured, and then finally we'll take a look at this in action, controlling my living room AV setup. As you can see, the user interface is divided into multiple pages, and each page contains a range of different devices. This is fully configurable. You can create as many pages as you want and pick which devices you want on which page. You can also optionally add a picture to the top of each page if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you how you set this up. You might want to have a single remote with pages for different rooms, or you might go down the route I've done and have different pages for different types of devices. For example, I have a page here for my living room TV setup, a page for activities, which we'll talk about in a minute, a page for lighting, a page for controlling my multi-room audio system, and a page for controlling my central heating. Then on each of these pages, we've placed what are so-called entities. Entities relate to your devices that you want to control, and each entity has a specific type. And the type defines its functionality and the type of user interface shown on the remote. For example, my TV has a remote control entity type, and if we click on that, it'll bring up a bunch of buttons on the screen, and these are separated across a few different pages. So we have a page here for just normal sort of number buttons, a page with a list of inputs on the TV, and a page with a bunch of apps that you can launch. And pressing these buttons will launch the relevant app on the TV. The remote also has actions assigned to the various physical buttons, so the D-pad, the volume control, the back button, home button, play and pause, all those sorts of things will control the TV. You can also go in after the fact and edit a remote control entity to rearrange the buttons on the screen or change which actions are assigned to the physical buttons. Another type of integration we have is a so-called media player entity, and for that we have the Apple TV. A media player entity has a different user interface, and this can show things like the currently playing media, album art, a progress bar, that lets you skip through the track, things like that. That would all show up here if the Apple TV was playing something. Some of the physical buttons will also work to control the device, so you'll have things like the D-pad, that will all control the Apple TV, and we also have this additional button here that on the Apple TV allows you to pick different apps that you want to launch. However, with a media player entity, you can't really customize it on the fly. You're limited to the user interface and button assignments that the entity comes with. The next entity type we have is a light, and this particular one here is being pulled in from Home Assistant. If we tap the icon on the left hand side, that'll turn the entity and the lights on or off, and then if we press on the right hand side, it'll pull up this interface, and this gives us even more controls. With these particular lights, I have RGB smart bulbs, so in here I have control over both the brightness and the colour temperature, and if I swipe to the next page, I also have control over the actual colour of the lights. However, like with a media player, there isn't much customization beyond this. So I can't, for example, have an option in here for a few different lighting scenes. If I wanted anything like that, it's not really possible with this entity type. That's why if we come out of here, I have a separate remote control entity here called lighting scenes. And in here I have a button to trigger each of my lighting scenes. So we have warm, cool, night light, colourful, and if I press those will trigger different lighting scenes. And we'll talk about this in a minute, because creating something like this is not exactly simple. So that was a light entity. The next type of entity we have here is a switch. And once again, this one here has been pulled in from Home Assistant. And this one lets me turn on and off the adaptive lighting that I'm using in my living room. Adaptive lighting just means that the brightness and colour temperature of the lights automatically change throughout the day. So this switch here lets me turn that on or off. With the switch entity, if I press the button on the left hand side, it'll turn the option on and off, as we can see there. However, if I press the text, it will open up the entity full screen like the other entities, and just give me one big button that also lets me control the switch. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this. It feels a little bit clunky that the way to use a button normally is you have to click the icon, and if you press this, you just get this pointless full screen thing you've then got to close out of. And there's also a different entity type called button. This works in the exact same way, except all you can do with the button is push it. It doesn't have a concept of turning it on and off. But once again with the button, it does the same thing. If you click the icon, that will trigger the button, and if you click the text, it pulls up a full screen button, which, again, is a bit weird. And that's one issue I've found with this sort of initial interface. Beyond placing just standard entities on these pages, you can't really customize how they're displayed. With a switch entity like this, I'd much rather to be able to change how it's displayed, for example to show a radio button or a checkbox. Or for things like buttons, I'd much rather be able to change out how they're laid out, so maybe lay them out in more of a grid, rather than each button having to take up a full width of the screen and show them in one big long list. You'll also notice that all of these entities have a concept of being on or off, and that's displayed beneath each entity. This is fine for things like lights or a TV where you can determine their state. However, for things like my lighting scenes remote, it doesn't really have a state, so I'd rather be able to turn that off so it doesn't just sort of say unknown below this. Unfortunately, this isn't possible. The same goes for remote controls like the TV remote back here. For some devices, it's easy to determine whether the device is on or off and show the appropriate state. However, when you're using infrared remote controls, that isn't exactly possible, since all the remote can do is send an on or off command to the device, and some devices don't even have discrete on or off commands, they just have a power toggle command, and that makes it almost impossible to determine the power state of the device. There isn't a way currently to configure a device to not have a power state, which means you can end up in a situation where the on-off state reported by the remote is completely out of sync with the device itself. Again, this isn't a huge deal, and it's something that could easily be fixed with a software update, and that could allow more customization over how these screens are displayed, but it is a slight niggle at the moment. The final entity type we have here is a thermostat, and once again, this is pulled in from Home Assistant. From here, I can click into this, we can adjust the current set point and temperature. We can also go down to the bottom here and we can change this heating mode. We can see the current temperature as well below the current set point. It all works. However, once again, like the media player and light entities, you can't really customize this beyond this. For example, in Home Assistant, my thermostats have a list of presets, and that lets you do things like boost the heating for a period of time, advance the schedule, or cancel any overrides and go back to the schedule. However, these are not exposed by the thermostat entity on the remote. This could likely be fixed with a software update, but again, it's currently a bit of a limitation. And this is kind of my main gripe with this device currently. The set of entities that are available don't quite have as much functionality or customizability as I'd like. It would be really nice if I could expand the existing entities by adding additional buttons or slightly changing the user interface layout, but currently that's not really possible. The only entity that lets you really create a custom user interface is the remote entity, but this is still limited to just buttons on the screen, and you can't really do things like have labels or return information back to the user. There are also some types of entity that I feel would be useful but aren't currently supported by the device. I've already shown most of the supported entities in this video, however there are two more which are supported. A sensor, which lets you display a particular value on the remote, and a cover, which represents things like blinds or curtains and provides controls for things like the position or tilt of the device. However, it would also be nice if it supported entities such as a numerical input or a drop-down menu, and that could be really useful for connecting to Home Assistant. Currently, since these aren't available, your only option is to create a bunch of buttons in Home Assistant that either pick different entries from a drop-down or pick different numbers on number input, and then when you add those to the remote, you'll just end up with a big list of all those buttons, which isn't exactly ideal. However, there is one way that you can slightly customize the user interface, and this is by creating activities. Activities allow you to combine multiple devices into a single interface, and you can create on-screen elements and button assignments spanning all of the devices in the activity. For example, we have an activity here called Watch Apple TV. And if we go into this, we'll see it'll start up, and then we get a media player entity from the Apple TV up here. So if media was currently playing, we would see it at the top. And then we have various buttons that will launch various different apps on the Apple TV. The D-pad will also control the Apple TV directly. However, the volume up and down buttons and the mute buttons will instead be sent to the TV directly. Activities can also have a set of actions that are performed when the activity is opened, and then another set of activities that are performed when the activity is closed. In this setup here, for example, opening the activity will switch my TV to the HDMI input that's connected to my AV receiver, and then it will switch the AV receiver to the Apple TV's input, and then it will turn the Apple TV on. Now, this is a relatively simple setup, but if you had a much more complicated home cinema install, you could, for example, have an activity to watch movies, and that would turn on a projector, pull down a projector screen, dim the lights, close the curtains, and then launch a media player app. So these activities can be really flexible. Within the activities, you also get a reasonable amount of customizability over the user interface. You can add multiple pages on the screen, you can add buttons that perform actions across all the different devices in the activity, and you can even change how the buttons are all laid out, change the icons, change the text, all that sort of stuff. You can also change how the different physical buttons are assigned to each of the different devices, and you can also set up differences between long press and short press across all the buttons. So activities do give you a reasonable amount of flexibility for creating your own custom user interfaces, but there's a bit of a downside. And the downside is, like I discussed with the other entities, activities have a concept of being on and off. For example, if I close this Apple TV entity up here using the cross button without explicitly pressing the power button, we can see that the remote still says that the Apple TV activity is running. You can group activities together so that switching between activities in the same group switches off the previous activity, but you can't eliminate the concept of an activity having a power state entirely. This is a bit of a shame, since there are situations where it would be really useful to create an activity purely to build a custom user interface, but where the concept of being turned on or off could get confusing to the end user. For example, I'd have loved to create an activity to create a sort of central user interface to control all my different lighting scenes. I could just have buttons in Home Assistant, one for each scene, and put them all into an activity to show them on the screen. However, this sort of activity having a concept of on or off would just be a bit confusing, and it would just look weird to the end user. Especially because when an activity is on, you can see here, it kind of shows this additional area at the top of the screen with additional almost picture or album art when the activity is on, so that would be a bit weird for lighting scenes. Now, of course, once again, this is something that could be easily changed with software updates, and I imagine that my setup here is really just a bit too simple for activities to be truly useful. If you had a much more complicated setup, then you'd probably find activities to be much more helpful. But that's it for the user interface on the device. Beyond what we've seen already, all you've really got is a little menu available in the top right if we click that there. It just lets you do basic things like set network connections up, do some basic settings, and it gives you a code here that you can show, and this is the code that you use to access the web interface. So if you click that there you go. That's the code that you'd use to access the web interface. But that's really it for this real menu on the device here. Most of the settings still need to be done through the web interface. So let's take a look at that now. So now, let's take a quick run through of the software side of things. I'm not going to do this as a full tutorial, since my plan for this video is more to showcase the device and its features. However, I feel it's important to show the software side of things as well, just so you know what to expect and you can decide whether this is a suitable device for your setup. Also bear in mind that this software is still under active development, so chances are things you see here will change and hopefully improve over time. And just to provide context, I'm currently running the latest non-beta version, which is 2.6.12. So first up, here we have the web configurator. This is accessible simply by going to the remote's IP address in a web browser, and when you're asked to authenticate, you just need to enter the 4-digit code that you can get on the remote itself. And here we have the main screen, and this gives you a few different options and a navigation bar at the top. The first page we're going to take a look at is this Entities page. This provides a list of all the entities that are configured and have been added to the remote. So in here we can see we have the lamps, we have the TV, we have the Apple TV, we have the thermostat, all that sort of stuff. And if you click on most of these entities, the only options you really get are an option to rename it and add a description. Now, the exception to this is the remote control entities, so if we go into the TV remote here, we get a bit more customization option. For example, in here at the top we have a user interface tab, and this lets us manage the different pages and add buttons to them. So in here we could go into here, we could click a grid area, we could pick the icon or a text button, pick what we want, we can set the text to show on the button, pick the command from the TV we want to add, and so on. There's also options in here to create all your different pages, reassign your pages. You can change how the grid's laid out, you can make buttons span multiple grid boxes, all that kind of stuff. You can get quite customizable with it. And then next up, here we have the button mapping tab. And this lets you pick which actions are assigned to each of the physical buttons on the remote. Each button can have two separate actions assigned. You can have one action for when it's a short press and one action for when it's a long press. So we can click, for example, long press here and pick which command is assigned to that. So this can be really useful, and it's really good being able to customize the remote entity to better suit your needs. However, it's a bit of a shame that this can only really be done for remote type entities and not for any other entity type. Now, if we wanted to add a new entity to the remote, we can do this by clicking the Add button in the top right, and this will provide a full list of the available entities and integrations on the remote. For example, we can pick infrared or Bluetooth, and this would let you control a device using those. I've tried infrared and it does work. You can either pick your device from a list of existing devices, upload a set of infrared codes that you found elsewhere, or learn commands from an existing remote. I haven't tried Bluetooth myself, but if we go into here, you've got a list of profiles, we can see in here we have a list of types of devices that are supported. So these are the sort of devices you could probably connect to and pair over Bluetooth. But where things get more interesting are the other integrations that use local network control. The ones listed here as developed by Unfolded Circle, these all come with the device and they're included. So for example, we can connect to Home Assistant, Apple TV, Philips Hue, and so on. And then down the bottom, we can see a couple of other integrations that say they were developed by me. These are custom integrations that I've built, and we'll talk about those shortly. Each of these integrations also include their own setup flow. So when you click to add it, the integration will provide some sort of on-screen wizard to let you connect to the device. For example, when you use the Apple TV integration, it'll ask you to enter the IP address of the Apple TV, and then the Apple TV will display various pairing codes on the screen, and you'd enter those back into the web interface here. So yep, that's our list of integrations you can add. You either have the ones that are included or custom ones that I've built myself. And that now brings us on to the integrations page itself. This page provides a list of all currently configured integrations, and in the top right here we can click to add new. Clicking add new integration from the top here just brings us to the same list we had before. But what you can also do is you can go back and click to install custom, and this will let you upload a custom integration that you've either built yourself or downloaded from elsewhere. Unfolded Circle provides a list on their website of some of the known custom integrations, and if you dig around on GitHub, you can sometimes find more. However, this isn't like Home Assistant where there's a huge library of custom integrations available yet. Unless you have a very popular device, you may need to be prepared to build your own integration. We'll talk about that in a second, but before that, we'll quickly go through the Home Assistant integration, since I imagine that's what a lot of you have been waiting for. To set up the Home Assistant integration, you can do it purely from the remote itself. However, if you want a bit more functionality, you can first install the Home Assistant the Unfolded Circle integration into Home Assistant, and then set up the Home Assistant integration within the Unfolded Circle web interface. With all this set up, we can then go into Home Assistant, click the little gear icon next to the device, and click Share Entities with Remote 3. And then from here, I can then pick each of the entities in Home Assistant and pick which entities I want to share with the Unfolded Circle remote. Then, once that's done, I can then go back to the Unfolded Circle interface, and all the interface entities that I've picked from Home Assistant will show up in here. So as you can see here, I have the living room lamps entity, I have the thermostat entity, and I have all the other ones, the control switch for adaptive lighting, a couple of media players, and so on. However, as I mentioned earlier, you're limited in the types of entities that you can use. For example, you can't currently from Home Assistant share entities of types like number, text, select inputs, things like that. So that's a bit of a shame. Of course, this is absolutely something that could be fixed in a future software update, but again, it is a limitation at the moment. But it is still really cool being able to integrate a physical remote control with Home Assistant this easily. So that's Home Assistant integration, but what if you instead want to create your own custom integration that runs directly on the remote? Well, that's what I've done with these two integrations here. We have the Hisense remote integration that connects to my Hisense TV using its built-in MQTT broker, and we have MQTT remote, which I've built to allow me to create custom remote controls on the fly that I can connect up to Home Assistant. And this is what I've used to create that lighting scenes remote we saw earlier. As we can see, if we go into the Hisense remote, integration here and click to start setup, we're presented with the setup wizard that I've built, and this sets up the integration. So in here it asks for the TV's IP address, its MAC address, and a pair of TLS certificates that some TVs require. Once you fill this in and press next, the TV will display a pairing code on the screen and you'd be asked to enter that into the web interface here, and that would connect it all up. And now with all that set up and working, we can see we have a remote control entity showing up over here. And this is the TV remote we took a look at earlier. The second MQTT remote integration I've created here lets me very easily create custom remote controls where each button publishes a specific message to a specific MQTT topic. I can then relatively easily get setup logic in Home Assistant or Node-RED to respond to these events. This was very quickly cobbled together, so we go into the integration and click to start setup. We simply have a text area, and in here you would paste in a large configuration JSON string. Down here we can see an example of such configuration, and in here we have a list of different remotes that we want to create. Each remote has a name, some MQTT connection information, including the available commands. So we have the available commands here. Each command includes the MQTT topic that the command should publish to and the value that it should publish. And then we have these objects here for button mapping and UI pages. Button mapping allows us to assign these commands to physical buttons on the device, and UI pages lets us set up a list of pages that will be displayed on the remote screen. Each page contains a list of buttons to be displayed on the screen, and each button contains either the text or icon to be displayed on the button, the X and Y coordinates of the button to be placed on the screen, the width of the button, and the command to be triggered when the button is pressed. This custom integration is pretty useful, and at some point I'll need to tidy up the code and publish it on GitHub. However, the fact that I had to create these custom integrations is a bit of a gripe with this device currently. Currently, there's no way built in to build a simple custom integration without writing your own from scratch. On the other hand, with the SofaBaton X1S remote, it's entirely possible to add a custom device simply by specifying a list of URLs to call for each button. With the Unfolded Circle, on the other hand, you have to go all out and build a completely custom integration. Of course, as time goes on, hopefully these devices will become more widespread, more custom integrations will be built, and you won't really need to build your own. However, right now it's a bit like the very early days of Home Assistant, where the number of supported devices is relatively limited. So now, let's quickly touch on how you can build a custom integration. This is in no way going to be a tutorial, and even right now I'm far from an expert on this. I simply got to cobble together these two integrations myself and sort of learnt as I went. I kind of built these of an evening. However, the integration development process is actually quite smart. Each integration is simply a Linux program that runs its own WebSocket server. The remote then connects the WebSocket server for each integration, and everything is handled through that. So your integration can be built in practically any language you want, as long as it implements the Unfolded Circle WebSocket API. Unfolded Circle has created libraries for both Python and Node.js, and this handles much of the API implementation for you. And as we can see up here, they've also provided some examples to get you started. So for example, here we have a remote example. This shows how you create a custom remote control with Python using the Unfolded Circle remote. And it's all actually relatively simple. And what's really clever about how they're doing this with WebSockets is that the integration doesn't need to run on the remote itself. You can write your integration and run it directly on your computer. When you run the integration you've built, it'll start up a WebSocket server, and the Unfolded Circle web configurator should discover the integration on your network and allow you to set it up. You can then set it up and use the integration on the remote while it's still running on your computer. This is great, since it makes implementation and testing much quicker. You don't need to constantly keep packaging and installing the integration on the remote every time you want to test it. You can simply fire it up on your computer and the remote connects to it. And then when you actually want to run the integration on the remote directly, all you need to do is compile it to a single Linux ARM binary and upload it to the remote, along with a JSON file that provides metadata for your integration. If you're using Python, Unfolded Circle provides a Docker image that uses PyInstaller to build a suitable executable. So at a very high level, if you wanted to build a custom integration, using their example here, all you would really need to do is write potentially even just a single Python script like this one that defines the remote and implements the WebSocket API using their UC API Python library. You could have a single script like this that's the integration. In this example, this single script is the entire integration. And then all you have alongside that is this JSON file, and this kind of just provides metadata to the remote about that integration. You then run the provided PyInstaller scripts, which you package this up into a single binary, combine that, put that binary into a tar archive along with the JSON file. You'd upload that tar archive to the remote, and it should just work. So building custom integrations is entirely possible if you have any sort of software engineering experience. and I was able to cobble all this together pretty easily. However, documentation is currently pretty lacking, so I did have to dig through the code for the Unfolded Circle API library itself, and also the code for some other integrations to sort of figure out how everything actually works. So that was a look at integrations, and that now brings us on to the next thing in the remote, which is this Activities tab. In here we can create activities, which is what we saw before, and this is where we have the Watch Apple TV activity. And if we go into this activity, we can see that we have a list of all the entities that are added to it, and then on the Sequences tab, we have our list of actions to be performed when the activity is started or stopped. As you can see here, when I start the Apple TV activity, it switches the input source on the AV receiver to the Apple TV input, and it switches the TV's HDMI port to HDMI 2, which is what's connected to the AV receiver. And then on the User Interface tab, we can configure the UI for the activity. And as you can see, we can add multiple pages and add different buttons to each of these pages. And these buttons, like on the remote we took a look at before, these buttons can be set to perform any activity or any action across any device that's been added to the activity. Similarly, on the button mapping tab, we can do the exact same thing. We can map any of the physical buttons on the remote to any of the devices that are added to the activity, and we can have separate actions for both a short press and a long press. So that was activities. Next up we have macros. So a macro simply lets you define a sequence of actions to be performed across one or more devices, and these can be triggered by a single button press on the remote. So in here, for example, we can include multiple different devices here, and then in sequence we can say different actions we want to perform on those devices. And you can even add in things like, add all these devices. You can also add in things like delays to kind of delay between actions if you need to. And then finally we have activity groups. These let you group together multiple activities so that when you start one activity, it turns off any other activities in that group. This is quite nice because on the sofa bathroom remote, it also has a concept of activities, but if you start any activity and switch to another one, it will stop that other activity. You can only have one activity going on at once. With this, you could have different types of activities running in parallel. So you could maybe have TV activities, only one TV activity at a time, but then have different activities for, I don't know, lighting scenes, and then they could run separate to the TV activity. So this is quite a nice concept to have. But there you go. That was most of the configuration we would need to put all this together. But now we need to put each of these entities onto the screens on the device itself. So to do this, we go back to the home page and click to customize your remote. In here, we can add a list of pages down here, and on each of these pages, we can add each of our entities. On the side here, you can also upload custom images to show behind the remote screens. That's what I've done here. Just took a few photos and put them on. And then if you go into one of these rooms here like this, you can click to add entities, and you can add any of your entities to this screen. However, this is where I mentioned earlier that unfortunately there aren't that many customization options. All you can really do on these pages is kind of add entities to them, rearrange them, maybe rename them. That's really it. You don't really have much more flexibility than that. And it'd be really nice if you had maybe a bit more flexibility to lay these out in a grid, make something only go across half the screen, maybe have entities that don't show their on-off state, things like that. But unfortunately, all you can do right now is just have a big list of entities on each page. But after all that, we now have the remote fully configured. So all that's left in the web interface now is just this little settings section here. It's all pretty basic stuff. Things like the power on, power settings, the screen timeout, your Wi-Fi settings, nothing particularly exciting. But after all that, let's look at the software side of things. So now let's quickly jump down to the living room and take a look at this in action. So now let's do a quick run through of the remote working in practice. So here we are in the living room, and you can see just down to the side there, we've got the remote on its dock next to the TV. And it looks really, really neat there. It looks like a really premium device. And you can see the cable there, that's connected to the network over PoE, so it's getting power and Ethernet over that single cable. So all we need to do now is we pick the remote up, it'll work. So we can pick the remote up, it'll wake up, and we can start using it. So first thing we'll do is just take a look at the TV itself. So we can pick the TV remote because that's what we want to use. So pick TV. And from in here, we can start using the TV. So D-pad buttons, they all just work as you'd expect, like that. We can also enter numbers if we want. I won't do that because it'll put on live TV, which has copyright issues, but the number buttons do work. We can also switch to these here. So we can press AV, for example, and that'll switch the TV to the AV input. We can also go to the option for apps. We can pick an app to launch. Say we'll tell it to pick YouTube, for example. So if I pick YouTube on here, the TV will launch the YouTube app. Give it a second. There we go. YouTube now works. And similarly from in here, you can even do things like, say, volume controls. If I press mute, for example, you'll see the TV will mute in the top right. It'll unmute, volume down, volume up, both work. That all works. We're able to control the TV with it. So obviously that is the TV remote. Of course, there's other options, so we can go out of that. We can also go into Apple TV. So this is where we can take a look at one of our activities working. So with the setup here in terms of the Apple TV activity, we have an Apple TV inside the cabinet there, and that's plugged into one of the HDMI inputs on my AV receiver. And then the AV receiver is connected to the TV over HDMI 2. So without this, to do it sort of normally, you need to use switch the TV to HDMI 2 and then switch the AV receiver to the appropriate input. Whereas with this remote, we have our activity. So if I press Watch Apple TV, it'll all do it automatically. So we'll press that there. As we see, the TV has switched to HDMI 2. The AV receiver has switched the HDMI input connected to the Apple TV. If we give it a couple of seconds, the Apple TV comes up. And then because this remote has the Apple TV in the activity, if I then use the remote here, this is now controlling the Apple TV directly. So you're not having to worry about things like HDMI CEC, where you're passing commands to your TV and that's meant to pass it onto the Apple TV, and sometimes those don't work properly. It just directly controls the devices within that activity. Similarly, because I created this screen myself, I can launch different apps. I can press YouTube, for example, and that will instantly launch YouTube on the Apple TV directly, which is pretty cool. And then in here as well, the volume commands will also work, but we see if you press those are being sent directly to the TV, not via the Apple TV. So again, they happen much quicker. You're not having to rely on sending commands to the Apple TV and hoping that successfully controls the TV. The commands just go straight to the TV from the remote in the activity. What we can also do here is take a look at how the media player entity can pull album art from a device that's connected. So here I've opened up Spotify on the Apple TV, muted for obvious reasons, but if I then start some music playing, you'll now see that it actually shows up on the device itself. We get the album art, and if I skip between tracks, I think, can you next button? Yeah, the Apple TV doesn't allow, you have to use the arrow keys. But as you can see, if I skip through tracks, it also correctly updates the album art on the device. So yep, that is the media player. So we can now actually use a media player in an activity and actually get a little bit more information than just buttons. You can actually get information back on the screen. This is really, really cool. I just wish it was available a little bit in more areas. You could send arbitrary information. It wasn't just only for media player types, but that does work. Likewise, we go out the activity, we now have a larger screen showing that activity is still running. We could also go back to the devices screen and just open the Apple TV directly. This is outside the activity, but we can once again see it working. Within here, I think we can still, again, press next. We can still skip through this, still control it all like that. So that all works completely fine. Now, what you can also do in here is, in theory, you can use this little progress bar and drag this around to different positions. It's really fiddly. I think the screen's just, it needs a little bit of tweaking on the sort of hitbox or whatever it's called to make that work. But you can see, if you catch it, you can drag that slider along to different track positions. Now, right now, that's not working. I suspect it's just a limitation of the Apple TV, and the integration with this is it won't work on the Apple TV. But with other devices, or especially if you're building your custom integration, you can actually receive an event when this is used and use this to jump the playhead around. So that is really cool. It's just going to be a bit hit or miss as to whether your device supports that ability. But yeah, the media player integration is really, really cool. I just wish it was a little bit more customizable, if I could add a few more custom buttons to the screen. It's a bit of a shame you can't currently do that, but yeah, this all works. Then when it comes to media player integrations, we also have my multi-room audio system integration. We'll take a look at this in more detail in a dedicated video, but it's a very similar idea. I can come into here, I can pick what source multi-room system's playing, and I can also control the tracks it's currently playing in each room. So that also works with this remote. This is just a Home Assistant media player entity, and I've been able to pull that through into the remote. We've also got our climate, so this is the thermostat. Again, we saw this before. I don't know why I'm demonstrating it here because you're not going to be able to feel the heating turning on, but I could control the heating from this. And then the more interesting one we can see here is the lights. So as we can see, the lights are turned on. We can turn them off with that button there. We can turn it on again. We can also open this up here, and in here we can control settings. So we can change the brightness like that. Don't know what's going on with the color temperature on that one. It's a bit fiddly, but we can see here, we can change the color temperatures, move it to cool, move it back to warm, and that's changing all the lights in the room. Put the brightness up full, we can do all that, and that all works. Likewise, because these are RGB bulbs, we can go to the next page and we can pick a color. So we can pick colors, and that'll change all the lights to that color. Of course, in practice, you probably want some way to maybe have two sets of colors. So maybe two separate groups of devices you can change the color of independently. So it'd be really nice to let you customize the UI if you have like two separate color wheels. But yep, you can use this to change the color of the lights. That all works really pretty well. And obviously on the screen, you've once again got just a brightness slider down the bottom. And then as we talked about before, I've got adaptive lighting set up in here, so I can have the lights shift throughout the day. Currently that's turned off, so I could play about with the lights, but if I turn on adaptive lighting here, the lights will automatically shift, and because it's quite late in the evening, they'll all turn to quite a dim, warm sort of light, or we can turn that off and we can manually override it and do what I want with it. But yeah, that works to control the lights as well. So yeah, as you can see, this is doing an absolutely amazing job controlling my living room AV setup. It just works brilliantly. There's only one downside I found in sort of practical use with this, and that is because this is a Wi-Fi device, it maybe takes a little couple of seconds or so to connect to Wi-Fi if it's gone to sleep. So when it's on the dock, it's always kept woken up, but if you leave it just sitting beside you on the couch, after a period of time, it will go to sleep to save the battery life. You can change that time, I think by default it's a few minutes. The downside I found is, for example, with my TV remote, this connects the TV over Wi-Fi. So if you pick the remote up and it's just woken up, it won't respond to commands for a couple of seconds until it's connected to Wi-Fi. Now, it does show a little symbol in the top right when it's not connected, and then that symbol changes when it's connected, but it is very easy to go, oh, I want to pause that or change the volume, pick the remote up, press the button, and then wonder why it's not working. I imagine how much of an issue this is depends on how quickly devices can connect to your Wi-Fi. With my setup here, it's not too bad, although I found that this device wasn't connected to my 5 GHz networks. It technically supports it, but just wouldn't connect, so it was stuck on 2.4. Now that's fine, but with my network here, I had an option set up on my access points to delay the beacons of 2.4 GHz SSIDs, so that dual band devices would generally prefer 5 GHz, but I found that was making this device take even longer to connect to Wi-Fi. So turning that off has helped. It's now maybe only takes a couple of seconds. The only downside I found is I can't seem to find any way to set a static IP address on this. It only seems to use DHCP. Whereas I'd like to think if I could set a static IP on this, that would make it connect to Wi-Fi even quicker because it wouldn't need to wait on an IP address. So hopefully they change that in the future. But yeah, something to bear in mind is there is a slight delay between picking up and controlling a device over Wi-Fi. If that's an issue, you may want to consider, say for example, for essential actions like maybe a TV remote, using infrared instead since that's immediate, and then using network only for more advanced functions that you can't do over infrared. But yeah, it works. So there you have it. That was a look at the Unfolded Circle Remote 3. And this is an absolutely incredible device. It's exactly what I've been looking for in a universal remote control. The hardware is beautifully made, and the process for building custom integrations is actually not nearly as painful as I thought it would be. However, right now, there's definitely still some work to be done on the software side of things, so if you're planning on buying this and expecting to simply plug it in and immediately start controlling all your devices, you may be a bit disappointed. But if you don't mind putting in a bit of work to set everything up and you're prepared to maybe build a few custom integrations, this is an absolutely incredible option, and I really hope they can expand the software even further to improve on some of my minor complaints. And that brings me on to my final point, which is pricing and availability. Currently, this isn't available for general retail sale. However, they're currently accepting pre-orders, which they claim will ship towards the end of Q1 2026. I emailed them when this first arrived and asked about their long-term plans for availability, and they said that they do have plans to eventually sell these from stock through their own website. But right now, this is still a pre-order item. And then in terms of pricing, it's not cheap. But honestly, for this level of hardware, it's not terrible either. The current pre-order price for the remote and dock combined is €419, excluding shipping and tax. You can, however, just buy the remote on its own for €329, but just bear in mind that you'd be limited to wireless charging and wouldn't be able to learn IR codes until they implement the ability to do that without a dock. They also sell the dock on its own for €99, which may be useful if you wanted to have docks in multiple locations, such as maybe one beside your TV and one beside your couch. And personally, right now, I'm seriously tempted to buy a second remote. While I currently only have a single remote, I do currently have 2 docks. I can't quite remember why. I think for some reason during the Kickstarter they gave everyone an extra dock. I think it was due to a delay or something. I can't find the email that explained why, but I do have a second dock. But this does mean that I could simply buy a remote on its own for €329 and use it with a spare dock that I already have. Now that is still quite a lot of money, but this is such a unique device that I'm very tempted to get another one, either for another room or just as a spare in case this one ever dies. And then quickly speaking about if this one ever dies, the main concern with these remotes is if the batteries fail. I'm seeing it a lot with people that have old Logitech Harmonies, the batteries are starting to fail and they're now needing to look for alternative options. In the Kickstarter, Unfolded Circle did claim that the battery on this is replaceable. Now, I can't find how to do it. I don't know if this bottom maybe comes off. I can't see any obvious way to take it apart. The previous remote they did, there was like a button on the back and something slid out. So I can't see how you would change the remote in this, but the battery in this, but they do claim that the battery is replaceable. So If anyone knows how to get the battery out of this, please let me know. If not, I could probably email them and ask. But yeah, they did claim the battery is replaceable. If it actually is, then that's really good, because you could basically use this kind of indefinitely. There's no cloud dependencies. You could use this for as long as you wanted to. So I really hope it is replaceable, and replaceable with a sort of standard part, not some weird proprietary thing that they've made. So we'll see how that goes long term. But yeah, I absolutely love this thing, and I'm really tempted to get an extra one. And then the final thing I want to quickly address or rant about is where anytime I review something like this, be it a remote control or maybe some sort of like in-home, in-wall touchscreen, something like that, where that device costs around about the same as some sort of cheap Android phone, people comment going, that's ridiculous, how dare you buy that, you should just buy if you can buy a phone for that price, just use a phone. And it's kind of missing the point. Yes, I can absolutely use a phone to do everything this can do. I can take my phone out, everything this can do can be done through Home Assistant. But for some people, it is just nice to have a physical remote control, or maybe a physical touchscreen on the wall, something like that. If you're happy to just use your phone to control everything, and if you're kind of saying something like, why would you buy a remote control, you can just use your phone, then you probably are that sort of person. Well, that's fine, the remote just isn't for you. But for someone like me, I want to be able to just pick up a remote and just use that to control my AV setup. I don't want to have to go out of what I'm doing on my phone and launch a different app to control something. I'm also not glued to my phone 24/7, so chances are I might go downstairs to watch TV and leave my phone sitting on my desk. And I don't want to go all the way back upstairs to get my phone just because I've not got it. Whereas I can have this just sitting in the room, pick it up and use it. Similarly for guests, you can just hand them the remote and say, here, there's a remote, do you want to do what you want? You don't have to be like, oh, if you want to control that, you need to download this app and use this. So there is a real use for physical controls. Not for everyone, obviously, and at this sort of price, it's definitely not for everyone. But if you want physical controls, this is an absolutely brilliant option. Plus, even just having physical buttons is so much nicer than relying on a touchscreen. I can just feel for them. I'm not having to go around a screen, so yeah. Not everyone wants physical controls, but if you do, this is brilliant. It's just quite expensive. But there you go. That was a look at the Unfolded Circle Remote 3. And I think it's safe to say that finally someone has built my perfect universal remote control. There's still improvements to be made in terms of the software, and I really hope they can scale production to make this available as more of a general retail product, and if they can do that, I will be extremely happy. So there you go. Hope you found this video interesting or potentially useful if you're considering pre-ordering one of these remotes, and of course if there's any significant improvements in the software, I'll make sure to either show them in a dedicated video or at least as part of a general update video. But all I have to say now is thank you very much for watching.